time to expand our understanding of our web page from simply being an HTML document and start to think about how we can make that HTML document look the way that we want it to look by introducing the idea and the concepts around CSS. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and this is the mechanism that is the best known practice that's used right now for trying to format or style HTML documents, to basically give them an aesthetic. CSS is a language by itself. What it is it's a language that is used to identify parts of HTML trees, and once those parts of the HTML trees have been identified, to describe how they should be looked or positioned on a particular web page. So what we need to do is we need to talk about how to use CSS to change the way the browser renders an HTML document when it is displayed to a user in a browser. So when we talk about the technologies that are involved in building a web application, we can really break them down into overlapping set of three concerns. The things that we're interested in is we're interested in content. So the content would be in a web page would be things like the text that's part of a description, images, kind of the general structure of the document with headings and links with more info. All that content is recorded in HTML, and that is recorded in the context of the tag-based tree that we've looked at before, where we have tags that are drawn from the HTML schema, and between those tags, for example, a p tag indicating a paragraph, in between the opening and closing p tag, we would put the text of the paragraph. That's the content. So as the web has been developing and evolving over time, what we've seen is this desire to separate out different concerns in a document. And the other concerns that we want to separate out from our content is our presentation. So a real simple reason why you might want to separate out your content from your presentation is that you might want to present your document in different media. So for example, on a small screen of a phone, you might want your website to be presented in one way, but on a large desktop screen, you might want it presented another way. Or perhaps when you print out the document, you want it to be presented in yet another way. And so because the content remains the same in all of those cases, and all that differs is the presentation, the idea of pulling apart HTML and CSS was developed so that you could do one content once and then structure your presentation for the different places in which you wanted to present the document, the content. The presentation language then is CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets. The content language is HTML. Now the third thing that we haven't looked at yet is how to add interactivity to web applications. And so that has yet another language, and that's JavaScript. We'll look at that in future applications. But all three of those technologies, the ones that govern content, the ones that govern presentation, and the ones that govern interactivity, are all joined together in a web page or your web application, a series of web pages. And by cleverly organizing them so that they interact with each other, you get the experience of using full-featured web applications. So we've talked about the HTML. Now we need to talk a little bit about presentation and cascading style sheets. And we'll start here with a basic introduction to it. So the first thing that we need to tackle is trying to understand, where do you put the styling information of a cascading style sheet of the CSS language? Well, there are three primary places where they can be put. They can be put inline in an HTML document. They can be put in an internal style sheet, also in the HTML document. Or the cascading style sheet rules can be placed in a completely different document, and that's the external way of putting your CSS information together. Now, in these three cases, you can do each of them. You'll see each of them in documents that are out there on the web. The best known practice is to use an external style sheet. Nonetheless, I want to show you how it works in all three cases in case you encounter it. So let's look first at inline. So the way that inline styling works is that we add a style attribute to any of the HTML elements or tags that are already present. And we know that whenever you add an attribute to a tag, you add an equal sign, and you follow it with a string. So when we add a style attribute and we give it a value of something that's in a string, what's in the string is going to be the formatting for that element. So let's take a look and let me show you what I mean. So on the left is an example of a document that has no special styling applied. It just has default styling. And you can see that this HTML document starts with your doc type HTML header, indicating that we're going to be working in HTML5 now. It has a root node of HTML, so that's the outer pair of tags. We have a head tag and a body tag. In our head tag, we have a title that's going to make our browser just say say sample on the shape of the tab at the top. And in the body of the document, we just have one tag, which is an H1 tag for a headline tag, and the contents of that are the phrase, "This is a heading." If we would like to style that, so you can see how it renders on the bottom left, and on the bottom right, we'd like to style it so that it is blue. The way that we can do that is by going to that H1 tag, adding the attribute style, giving it an equal sign, and then within the quotes that follow, give it all the description for how we would like to style that element, that H1 element. So the contents of that string are the CSS language. The style attribute is part of HTML. So in this style attribute, we are merging together one language of CSS with the other language of HTML. Now what you can see there is we can see that we've identified that we would like to color this element blue, and I haven't given you a lot of information about how you choose color :blue, but we'll talk, and semicolon, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what I want you to see here is that when you add the style tag, you can change how one particular tag and anything that's nested within it gets rendered. That's inline styling. So what if we want to do an internal style sheet? All right, that's a little different. And in that case, what we do is we put the rules for how we want something to be styled in the head section of our document. So on the left, you can see the same basic HTML document with no styling other than the default styling that comes with the browser. And on the right, we've modified that HTML so that now in the head section of our document, we've added a style tag. Now again, the style tag is part of HTML. But the text that's within the style tag, the text that's nested within the style tag, that's the CSS language. And in this case, you can see that we have an H1 there. We have two curly brackets. We have color and we have blue. So we see that color in blue again. We saw that previously when it was inline with the H1 tag. We can see that we have a little bit more text though. This H1 tag and the curly brackets are a little mysterious. But what that ends up doing is by putting an internal style sheet in the top of our document, we're able to change the color of our H1 tag, the text in our H1 tag. And right, so if we look at this closer, you can see exactly what's going on there. You can get a better look at what's going on there. In this case, the style block in the head has referenced the H1 tag. And what happens here is that when we indicate H1, we're actually going to change the color of any part of our document that has an H1 tag. So we might have multiple H1 tags, and all of those would be turned blue in this case. So finally, let's look at an external style sheet. Now, an external style sheet is really the preferred mechanism by which we style our documents. And in this case, what we're going to do is not only are we going to conceptually separate out the idea of the HTML language and the CSS language, in our inline styling and in our internal style sheet, we conceptually had different languages, but now we're actually going to move the description of our styling outside into a different document from our HTML, really solidifying the idea that these are two separate ways of two different ways of creating two different ways of manipulating the content or bringing the content together to give a particular presentation. All right, so on the left we have the example of the internal style sheet, and so you can see the style tag in the head and the H1 in the color blue. And on the right, what we've done is we've added not the style sheet in the header, but we've added a link tag in the header. And this link tag has an href attribute, a type attribute, and an rel or rel attribute. And these three things come together to point the HTML document to another resource. So when the browser loads up an HTML document that has an external style sheet in it, it will receive that HTML. And as it's reading through the HTML and getting ready to present it to the user, it will encounter this link tag and see that there's another resource that it needs to go out to the internet and get, in this case a file called style.css. And before it will render the document, it will go out and get that additional file. Now in that additional file, which is in the block right below the external style sheet HTML, is the contents of style.css. And in there you can see we have exactly what was present within the body of the style tag on the left. So all we needed to do is move the H1, the curly brackets, and the color :blue semicolon into a separate file and reference it from our external style sheet. And in both cases, the rendering is exactly the same. Now the difference between the two is that the one on the left had a slightly larger HTML file. The one on the right had a smaller HTML file in terms of the number of characters that were in it, but it required the browser to make two requests, one for the HTML document and then a second request to the style sheet. So just the mechanism is slightly different about how it gets rendered, but the effect for the user is exactly the same. External style sheets are preferred for a couple reasons. First of all, it's just the idea that it reinforces the idea of separating content from presentation by putting them in different files. Another reason why it's preferred is it makes it a lot easier for multiple people to work on one project at the same time. So this way, if they were in separate files, you could easily imagine that one person would be working on the HTML and the other person would be working on the CSS. And since you would be working in separate documents, it would be fairly easy to make changes without impacting the other person. Finally, a really powerful reason why external style sheets are used is because when you put the style sheet into a separate file, you can have multiple HTML documents point to that style sheet file, and you only need to have it one place. So let's imagine you had a website that had maybe a main page, an about page, a privacy policy page, and maybe some content detail in a fourth page. You could have all three of those HTML files, which have different content in them, point using the link tag to the same CSS file. And by doing that, and by correctly writing your CSS, you would give all of those pages the same presentation, the same aesthetic, the same colors and fonts and layouts and widths and font weights and things like that. And you would only have to do it in one place. And so if you decided that you were going to change the global font for your website, you only have to do it in one place, and you don't have to do it in each one of those individual files separately the way that you would if you had an internal style sheet. And even worse, if you did inline styling and you wanted to change the color of your text, for example, you would have to go to every single tag where you had a style attribute and update it. And so the progression from using an inline style string and then going to an internal style sheet helps you to reduce the amount of text that you're writing within one document. And then as you move from an internal style sheet to an external style sheet, you're reducing the amount of style text that you have to write for your entire website. Very powerful. All right, so let's look in detail at the inline styling and the different components that are there. So this again is the most specific way of specifying how you want your text to be rendered. And we have a couple pieces to the CSS language. The first thing that we have is we have a property. Now the property is on the left side of a colon. This can be a little bit confusing because in HTML or XML, when you have an attribute like the style tag and you want to associate it with a value, you use an equal sign. But in CSS, you don't do that. In CSS, to associate a value with a property, you use a colon. So in this case, the property is color. We use a colon to pair it with a value. And in this case, the value is blue, which is a special word in CSS that turns things blue. And so we have paired the property color with the value blue, and we end it with a semicolon. Because this is in a style attribute, this styling only gets applied to the tag and its children in which the style attribute is embedded. So for example, the color blue doesn't apply to other tags that we might put in this document outside of this H1. All right, and then the target for this, of course, is just the specific element in which the style attribute has been embedded. Now, an internal style sheet makes a slight change, a little sleight of hand, because it does something very slightly different and conceptually different. We still have the property, and that's indicated by something on the left of the colon. And we have a value, and that's indicated by something on the right of the colon. And that property value pair is ended with a semicolon. So we could put multiple property and value pairs in this particular definition of H1, and they would all have to be bundled by those curly brackets. So the curly bracket on the top and the curly bracket on the bottom are bundling several different property value pairs that we would like to apply to the H1 tag. In this case, we only have one. Now the way that we've written this is we've given it a property and a value, and now what we have is something called a selector. This is part of the CSS language. So when we write our CSS like this, we say H1 and then we follow it by the curly brackets. What we're doing is we're saying to the browser, I want you, when this page gets rendered, to find all of the H1 tags and apply the styling that's within the curly brackets to it. So not only would just this one particular H1 tag that's down below, which we call the target, not only would this particular H1 tag be the target, but when you use an internal style sheet, all H1 tags become the target. So you don't have to write out a different description for every time an H1 tag exists within this HTML document. That style sheet addresses all of them at once. All right, now an external style sheet is very similar. The only thing is that we link the description of the styling to another file, as we've seen. And the way we do that is we use a link tag, and then we put that in the head of the HTML document. When we do this, we have to specify a couple attributes. We have to specify the href. This works the same way as an anchor tag or an A tag when we have a hyperlink. What the value of the href attribute contains is a URL for the file that has our CSS rules. So this could be a complete URL, as we've seen before, http://hostname, file name, etc., etc. If we don't put all of that information into the URL, what the browser assumes is that we're using the same information in the URL for the HTML document in which this command is embedded. So if this HTML document was loaded with an http: command and a particular host and a particular path name, and we just say style.css, then the browser is going to look for the style.css file right next to the HTML file in the file directory. So we specify where to find our style file using href. We tell the browser that what's going to be there is of type text/CSS, and we use the rel tag and we specify style sheet. The type and the rel are really boilerplate for CSS. That's not something that you often change. And then in that file, we see the same things that we had in our internal style sheet. We have our selector, and that in this case is H1, and that's going to apply to all H1 tags in the HTML document that links to it. And we're saying that the property of color is going to be set to the value of blue, and we end it with a semicolon. We could follow it with other properties and values. In this case, we only have one. So what that does is it means that for all of the tags within the HTML document that has referenced the external style sheet, the rules in the external style sheet will be applied to this HTML document. And so in this case, with this simple external style sheet in this simple body of the HTML, the color blue property and value pair will be applied to the H1 tag, rendering that text blue. All right. So that's one particular rule that we have in CSS, a rule for setting the color of the text to a particular color. That's a pretty common use for CSS. So we'll see examples of color and font. So let's complexify this a little bit. Is complexify a word? Let's make it more complicated. And then what we can do in order to make it a little bit more complicated is to increase the number of nodes in our HTML document. So now in the upper left, what we have is a little bit more complicated HTML document. We have a title, and we're using the external style sheet method of styling this document. So we're linking out to style.css. And the contents of the style.css file are in the upper right. Within the body of our document, we have two H1 tags. The first one says this is a heading. The second one says this is another heading. And then we have a P tag for a paragraph when we say this is a paragraph. And as it's rendered down below, you can see that it has a very different presentation. And as we look in the upper right of how that gets styled, now we see examples of a couple things. The first thing that we see an example of is multiple properties being applied to this document. So within the body of the style sheet, when we specify the H1 as the selector, we can see that not only are we setting the color of the text to blue, but we're also setting the font family to the font Courier. And we're setting the font size to 300% of its normal size. So those three properties are going to be applied to all of the H1 tags in our HTML document. And you can see that's true because this is a heading and this is another heading. Both have been made larger and they're blue and they're using the Courier font. Now we only had to specify one H1 selector in our styles.css file, and that was applied to all of the H1 tags in our document. Now also in our styles.css file, we followed up with another styling command, and we said we would like to style, in addition to the H1, we'd like to select all of the P tags. And for the P tags in our document, we want to make the color red. We want to use the font family Verdana. And then we want to use a font size of 150%. Now the syntax of the CSS file you have to be careful of. And so the best practices for the CSS file, and in some cases a required practice, is that each one of your property value pairs has to be followed by a semicolon. All of them need to be bundled together with the curly brackets. The indentation is not important. The indentation is for human readability. In between the two different selectors, the H1 and the P, we put a space just for readability, but notably there's not a semicolon after the second curly bracket in the H1 selector. Those stand on their own. All right, so this is an example of a more complicated external style sheet. We have two rules present, and each one of those rules has multiple properties and values, and you can see that that changes the rendering of our document from what the browser had as a default. Another use of CSS is to change the border of a particular element. So here's an example of changing the border. We have the same HTML in the upper left, and what we've changed on the upper right is we've added a new property to our P tag, and that property is border. That's followed by a colon, and after that is a sequence of values that help describe the border. You see that it's 2 pixels, solid, and green. All right, so what I'm not telling you a lot of, okay, so another thing to notice actually, before I tell you what I was going to say, is that unlike HTML, when you have a property and a value in CSS, the value doesn't have to be enclosed by quotes. In HTML, the attributes, for example, the href attribute in the upper left, is set equal to, using the equal sign, a string surrounded by double quotes, the contents of which is style.css. The CSS file, because it's a different language, uses a different syntax. It doesn't use an equal sign, it uses a colon, and the things on the right of our properties do not have to be enclosed in double quotes. They do have to end in semicolons, however. So what are all the different properties that are available to us for styling the different elements? We see color and font family and font size. Where did those come from, and why did we spell them the way that we spelled them? Well, there's a whole, there are pages and pages and pages of documentation for all the different ways in which you can style different elements within your document. They include all the different ways that you would imagine that a word processor would be able to format text. Bold and superscript and uppercase, shadows and colors and font weights, all these kinds of things that are typical for rendering in a word processor. They also include a fair number of commands about how to lay out the document in terms of whether or not an element should be in the top or the bottom, or the left or the right, whether it should, whether other content should wrap around the right or left side. Also, some of the typical things that you see present in the formatting of a word processing document. A lot of them, and we'll point you in future work to references where you can find different examples of these. It doesn't make sense to memorize them. Whenever you need them, you can look them up pretty quickly with a Google search. And the more that you manually are writing CSS files, the more likely it is that you'll just learn to remember the most common ones, or just through practice. All right, so this is an example of a border with CSS. So to summarize a little bit, CSS is a language. It's separate from HTML. It's used for presentation. And what we do is we use it to find locations in the HTML tree. So you might not have realized that's what we were doing, but when the style sheet refers to a tag, for example, the H1 tag, the P tag, or the A tag, what we're doing is we're thinking about the HTML document as a tree, and we're finding specific locations within that tree that we want to apply styling to. So far, we've seen examples of applying styling to one tag, two tags in the same document. If we had multiple tags that we wanted to apply the same styling to, we could use a shorthand notation, and instead of creating a separate CSS rule block for each one, we could combine them with commas, as we see here. So this syntax in a CSS file, h2, h3, a, means apply a 200% font size to all of the h2, h3, and a tags that are in our document. Now we could also list those separately. We could say h2 font size 200, h3 font size 200, a font size 200%. We could do that in 3 different blocks, but this is shorthand. But it's important to recognize that there is a comma there. That comma differentiates it from different ways of selecting other parts of the tree that we're going to see in a little bit. So not only does this formatting apply to the tag in which it's specified, but any nested tags as well receive that formatting. All right, so we've talked about 3 different ways of styling text: inline, internal style sheet, external style sheet. What if there are actually what if there are multiple styles present and they conflict with one another? For example, what if you have an inline style in your document, which is not the best known practice, but you might still have it occur, where you set your font to red, but then in your internal style sheet, you set all the same tag elements to blue. And then in an external style sheet, maybe for some reason you have all 3, you set that text to green. Which one wins? Well, the basic principle for understanding which CSS rule overrules other ones is the idea of proximity. So the rules that are farthest away from the HTML have the least precedence. So for starters, there's a styling sheet that's built into your browser by default. So for example, by default, the font that your text is rendered in is in Times Roman. That's considered the style that's farthest away from the HTML. It's default, it comes with your browser, you can change it for accessibility reasons and a couple other reasons you might be interested in. But that's the basic one. Now that can be overruled by an external style sheet. Now that's in a separate file, so that's considered farther away. So an external style sheet will be overruled by an internal style sheet that's located in the head of your document. And then if in addition to that you have inline styling using the style attribute in the HTML tag, that will override all the previous ones, the internal style sheet, the external style sheet, and the browser default. Now what if you have multiple rules, for example, in your external style sheet? Maybe you have a couple different rules that are trying to conflict with each other. Well, the more specific the rule is, the more that it takes precedence. Now we haven't really seen how different rules can be more specific than others, but we will. So a more specific rule takes precedence over other ones. And then finally, rules that come later in the document overrule rules that come in the beginning. And that kind of makes sense if you imagine that the browser is reading through the file like we would read through a document. And it would get some kind of a description about what the font should be at the top of the file. And then if at the bottom of the file it gets a different font for the same element, maybe you've put a selector for a paragraph tag in twice in your external style sheet. The second one is going to overrule the top one if they're otherwise exactly the same. Now this is a little bit in the weeds. It's not something that you're going to have to think a lot about, especially if you just put all of your styling in the external style sheet. But every now and then you do run into a situation where you're not quite sure which rule is taking precedence. Now don't forget, you can always right-click on elements within a browser after it has been rendered, and you can select an element. You can actually see which styling has been applied to the element. In the Chrome browser in the inspection tools, it's over on the right side. We can take a look at that in the future as we start to work closer with it. Now, much like the other languages, HTML and XML, there's also a online lint for CSS. So this one is run by the W3C organization. It's run on the URL jigsaw.w3.org. If you search for online CSS validator and then pay attention to make sure you end up at the W3C website, you'll find it pretty easily. And like the other validators, you can ask this tool to tell you whether or not you have well-formed CSS by giving it the URL of a style sheet, for example, your styles.css file, or by uploading a file from your hard drive, or by cutting and pasting the text into the direct input box, which we've done here. So in this case, what I did is I took the examples of the CSS that we had, I cut and pasted them in here, and I hit check and to see what it would do. It says, great, congratulations, no errors found. Now, if it had found an error, I was missing a semicolon, or I had a bad property value pair, or something like that, I would get feedback from this tool. So it's just a really helpful thing to have in your toolbox if you're struggling with trying to understand what's going on with your document and why your web page isn't rendering the right way. You can always cut and paste your CSS just to make sure that it's well formed. All right, so in summary, What we introduced in this lecture was the idea of cascading style sheets, or CSS. Cascading style sheets are a way of applying a presentation layer, an aesthetic, a layout to a document whose content has been specified in HTML. And we pull those two things apart by putting your CSS in one file and your HTML in another file and linking your HTML to your CSS. When your browser loads the HTML file, it will then make a second load to the styles and will apply the styles to your HTML. What CSS does is it is a separate language, a different way of writing descriptions for the computer than XML or HTML. And what it consists of is it consists of a selector which chooses a portion of your HTML tree and then a collection of styling elements that say what should those portions of the HTML that I have selected look like. And then the browser takes care of it from there. All right, we have a little bit more to talk about in CSS, but that's good for this lecture. Thank you for your attention.